Okay, we're going to get started. I'm going to be playing a little video at the beginning. If I can get just a thumbs up from people who have cameras on, and you can hear the audio, which will begin shortly.
Thank you for attending our Accessible Community Forum. For some quick housekeeping rules, this forum is being recorded and streamed to the ConnecTra Society Facebook page and the Disability Foundation YouTube channel. You may choose to have your camera on or off. All participants will be muted upon entry. To ask a panelist a question, you can either type your question in the chat box or use the raise hand function under reactions in the bottom of your screen. A moderator will call on you and unmute your microphone. Use the chat box for comments. If you require a screen reader, we recommend that you close the chat box. We will be sending out a complete transcript of the chat after the event to all attendees. During this event, we have automatic closed captioning available. Please go to the bottom of the Zoom meeting, click Live Transcript, and then Show Subtitles to turn them on. Before we begin, we'd like to take a quick moment to let you know how you can join an opinion research panel made specifically for British Columbians living with disabilities.
For 25 years, the Disability Foundation has been fostering meaningful experiences for Canadians with disabilities through outdoor recreation, social connectedness, innovative adaptive devices, and more. Today we are asking, how has the pandemic affected you? Help strengthen decision makers' understanding of your needs and experiences by joining an online opinion research panel consisting solely of people with disabilities and their caregivers. Make a difference in your community today. The Disability Foundation. Reimagine what is possible.
Thank you for attending our accessible. Thank you for.
There we go. And now on to Sonia, our wonderful moderator.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us and participating in this Accessible Community Forum on accessible parking, presented by the Disability Foundation and co-hosted by the ConnecTra Society and the Social Planning and Research Institute of BC, better known as SPARC BC. I'm your moderator today. My name is Sonia, and I am the Access and Inclusion Liaison with the Thompson Okanagan Tourism Association. I am on Spinal Cord Injury BC's Access BC team, and I'm a recently retired Paralympian, having competed for Canada for 13 years in the sport of wheelchair curling. I would like to begin by respectfully acknowledging the traditional territories of the Indigenous peoples of the land that we call BC. We are grateful to be living, learning, and working on this land. And I would also like to acknowledge that today is International Day of Persons with Disabilities. So very fitting that we're having this conversation. The purpose of this forum is to gain insights and feedback from the community around accessible parking in BC. Here at ConnecTra, we value diverse opinions and perspectives, and we want this to be a safe environment for everyone to share. Please be respectful of others, what others have to say. Our goal is to have a healthy dialogue and for this to be a learning experience for all. We will do our best to get to everybody's questions. The agenda for today and housekeeping details are posted in the chat. Reminder that this forum is being recorded and live streamed to Facebook and YouTube. And you're more than welcome to have your camera turned on or off. I would like to introduce today's panelists, and then each panelist will have an opportunity to also introduce themselves. So first, I'd like to introduce Lorraine Kopis, the Executive Director of SPARC BC, and Dan Coulter, MLA from Chilliwack and the Parliamentary Secretary for Accessibility from the Legislative Assembly of BC. Lisa Morishita, Senior Parking and Development Engineer for the City of Vancouver. Christy Lear, Advocate for Accessible Parking in Fort Nelson, BC, and a member of Spinal Cord Injury BC. And Mike Stiles, a former Paralympian, Board Chair of BC Moss, Secretary Treasurer of ASABC, and Director of ConnecTra. Now I will call on the panelists to also introduce themselves. Emily, is Dan with us?
Dan is here. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. All right. So Lorraine, if you would like to introduce yourself a little further.
Sure. Thank you for the opportunity to be part of this panel. As you mentioned, I'm Lorraine Copas. I've been with SPARC BC for about 12 years now. SPARC, as you would well know in this group, that we're responsible for the delivery of the parking permit program across BC, but there are other groups that also do it within their own local communities. And effectively, I really welcome the opportunity to look at the program, to interrogate how we can make it better, and to really work together to make it serve the needs that it's meant to serve. Thank you.
Thanks, Lorraine. Dan, if you could introduce yourself.
Yeah, so Dan Coulter, Parliamentary Secretary for Accessibility for British Columbia, as well as I'm the MLA for Chilliwack. I'm very excited to be doing this, and on International Day of Persons with Disabilities as well. It's very timely. I myself, I've been using a wheelchair for 22 years now, and I think I have a fellow MLA on the call, at least one anyway. I see Dan Davies, the MLA for Peace River North on, but I will say that our colleague and I, Stephanie Cadu, often speak in the House on parking issues. And I'm sure you've all heard those debates too. Anyway, thank you very much for having me. I'm really, really happy to be here.
Thank you, Dan. Happy to have you here as well. And Lisa.
Hi, everybody. My name's Lisa Morishita. My pronouns are she and her. And I'm so grateful to be with you this afternoon. I have been an engineer at the City of Vancouver for coming up on 6 years in a variety of different roles. I started out with public bike share, and then I designed sidewalks for a little bit, and now I'm working in parking policy for new buildings. So thank you so much for spending your afternoon with us, and really looking forward to the discussion.
Awesome. Thank you, Lisa. You're going to have a wealth of information for us, I'm sure. And Christy.
Hello, everybody. Yeah, thank you for having me on this panel. This is really, really big for me, and what a day to celebrate us. I'm from Fort Nelson, BC, and I'd like to recognize, I do speak to you on the national territory of Fort Nelson First Nations. We're Treaty 8 territory here, located up by the Yukon, kind of near Alaska. And I'm a mother of two and had a spinal cord injury 4 years ago. Prior to my spinal cord injury, I worked a lot with the Motor Vehicle Act in traffic control training, diverting cars on highways, making sure people are safe with oversized loads, and traffic safety and the public's best interest in mind. I'm a C5-6 quadriplegic, but I am by no means my diagnosis. And I'm really, really, really upset about this cap I've been entered into 4 years ago of handicap. So I'm really hoping to open up some insight on accessibility and movement in this sector, and give as much information as I can on my experiences on how we've been limited, and it's time to change. And thank you so much for having me on here. It's great to see all of you here. Thank you.
Thank you, Christy. Thanks for being here. And my good friend, Mike Stiles, has joined us today. Mike, can you introduce yourself?
Yes, so happy to join this panel as well. I've been in a chair 37 years on the 7th of this month from a workplace accident. I suffered a spinal cord injury when I was training a thoroughbred for the upcoming racing season. It was in September of the following year where I obtained my license to park, driver's license, and being able to park in a wheelchair accessible spot. Past Paralympian, one of the founding directors of BC Moss, Adaptive Sailing Association of BC, ConnecTra, and current chair of BC Moss and its Adaptive Sailing Association of BC. Also vice president of Accessible Okanagan and co-chair of the Accessibility and Age Friendly Committee in Asuyas. I also had been running a Fishing Forever event in Asuyas for 7 years prior to COVID happening. See, I live in Asturias with my wife and 2 daughters who are 5 and 7. And so happy to be here, like I said. And hopefully we can discuss some of these parking issues and come to a better solution, because it seems like most of us are having some issues with it. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure, Mike. Thanks for being part of the conversation today. I'd also like to acknowledge that one of our panelists is not able to be with us, sadly. Tara Cleve wanted to be here. She is with Support Services and Accessibility Manager to the City of Surrey. I'm so sorry that she isn't able to be with us today. So let's start off the conversation discussing the general availability of accessible parking spaces in BC. Just a reminder, as we move along, please type any questions or comments that you may have into the chat box or raise your hands to speak. I will pose questions or call on raised hands in order that they are received. We'll start off with an issue that came up several times in our survey responses. So according to our survey responses, the biggest issue is the lack of accessible spaces in general. And the second biggest issue is that the accessible spaces that do exist are not accessible. For example, they're not wide enough to accommodate a van with a wheelchair, ramp, or lift. They're located on a sloped surface, or the pathway from the parking spot to the entrance of the building is obstructed or not accessible for several reasons. So I'd like to ask this question to 3 of our panelists to start off this discussion, starting with Dan, then Lisa, and then Tara. So Dan, what are the current regulations or laws for accessible parking spots in BC?
Okay, thanks very much, Sonia. The Local Government Act enables local governments to make decisions on planning and land use within their jurisdiction, and the Building Act allows them to make standards for accessible parking and things like that. They can establish their own requirements, because in the Building Act, accessible parking is actually an unrestricted matter. So, you know, local governments are best positioned to set accessible parking requirements based on the demographics and types of buildings developed and the specific needs of their communities. There is guidance available by the CSA that has a standard on accessible design for the built environment. And so local governments who don't already regulate accessible parking may adopt those standards or establish requirements that work best for their communities. So that's sort of the short answer to it.
Okay, thanks, Dan. And I said I was going to ask this question of Tara as well, but she's not on our panel, so sorry about that. Lisa, what are the current regulations or laws for accessible parking spots in BC?
Yeah, so we, as a city, as a municipality, we write those into our bylaws. So when the province gave that authority to us, it kind of now lives both in the parking bylaw, which regulates the provision of off-street parking, so parking in buildings normally, as well as a little bit in the building bylaw. So kind of living in both of those documents. And like Dan said, it kind of varies a little bit from land use and in terms of how many spaces, and then we also provide design guidance on, you know, how wide are they, how much buffer space needs to be around each space, and the path of travel from that space to the entrance of the building. And so that really helps us provide guidance to those new buildings that are being constructed now to make sure that they work as best as they can.
Right. Thank you, Lisa. And just really encourage any of the attendees to pop your questions and thoughts in the chat so we can start having a conversation on any of these topics that we're bringing up. So please feel free to throw those questions in the chat anytime, and then I can throw them out there to the rest, to our panelists. Okay, so question, I have another question.
Christy has her hand up as well.
Okay.
I don't know if I'm supposed to put my hand up or just talk, so I'm just going to take it over here. It sounds like We did municipal bylaw here in Fort Nelson. As you can see, this sign behind me here in my background. And to enforce it wasn't a lot. We brought awareness through an accessible sign to start a new look on accessibility and start that conversation. So when people saw purple instead of blue, it brought their attention. And I just wanted to speak to that I see we've got to bylaws is the answer here, municipalities, and it's each our own. Yeah, I can reflect a lot on that with what we've done here in Fort Nelson. It worked really well, and we made van spaces and we made accessible spaces. So we did trial for 2, and I can speak to a lot of that throughout this panel if it ever comes up. So that's the whole point of the signs behind me, and that's what we've been doing so far. It does work, but what we found, it makes the space, but the community and the awareness has to come. And you can't enforce much from what I've understood. That's the hard part we found.
Great. Thanks, Christy. Okay, so I'm going to just carry on with some more questions, and please just any attendees throw in your questions. We can fire them off to the panelists. So people who obtain accessible parking passes have a wide range of abilities. For example, someone may have a mobility issue that requires crutches or a cane, but not a wheelchair. So this person would need to be in close proximity to the entrance of the building, but maybe not need an extra wide stall. Someone else may have a van with a ramp and need the extra space. Someone else may not have a van with a ramp, but still need the extra space to maneuver themselves into their own wheelchair. So for this reason, many people have expressed their concern over the idea of a van accessible only space. And then of course, some people have invisible disabilities. The suggestion of different tiers or color-coded accessible parking passes came up multiple times in our survey responses. So I'm going to direct this question to Lorraine, then Christy, then Mike. Lorraine, what are your thoughts on this suggestion around the different color-coded accessible parking spaces?
Hi. So I would say there's total openness to making changes to the program that would benefit the community who relies on the program. But the truth is, it is probably not enough of the right type of parking space. That is the most important focus, in that you do need van accessible parking. You need to have that signed and available. And for sure, in instances, some people would have suggested then maybe there's a different colored placard for that. But until we have more of the right type of parking in communities, you're still going to have some of the pressures we see today. But consider SPARC a partner in trying to get this right, and in whatever way that means. I should also mention that we have had a really good design with the City of Vancouver, and we have some of those resources available for communities to really look at the spaces, and even the CSA standards in some cases won't work as well as other standards. So I think even amongst those who are here today, a number of you helped to participate in that and inform that. So I think it's community working together. For sure, consider SPARC a partner. And I agree with the general direction of more and better and different types of parking.
Great, thank you, Lorraine. And before we move to Christy for that question, I see Robin has her hand up. Robin, what is your question?
Hi, I see I typed it in chat and it didn't appear, so I'll ask it. The question is for Dan Coulter. How many municipalities have created a new standard in the vacuum created when the province withdrew accessible parking? Here in Victoria, we're almost, just a few days short of 3 years since there's been no binding provincial standard, and we still don't have one. So I wonder how typical that is. What percentage of municipalities have regulated in this field?
I honestly, in full disclosure, I honestly couldn't tell you. In the 200 plus municipalities across British Columbia, I haven't looked at all their regulations or bylaws. I wasn't around when the province removed those from the building code, but yeah, so I couldn't answer that with a very clear answer. Lorraine might have a better answer though.
Oh, there. We are having a number of municipalities reach out to look for the guidance and advice. And so some of the design work we've been doing with the city will actually, I think, benefit a number of communities. Communities are all at different places on this. And again, I think that there are the early innovators. There have been some really tremendous work done around Central Saanich and that area within Victoria, trying to get it right. And champions like David Willow, Accessible Parking BC, who have really been trying to show the deficiencies in the current approach. And then you'll have communities that haven't thought through all of the design details that are really needed, or don't have as deep a connection with community. And so again, I think the work that you're doing here and what we try to do through SPARC is to raise awareness that yeah, we have to get it right within community. And that probably means different types of parking. And for sure, it means more of the right type of parking. When the building code dropped, it was only 1% of any, after 100 spaces, only 1% had to be accessible. So that left you with one space out of 100. And so that was the lowest common denominator. Many municipalities would be slightly better than that. But if you look at the Ontario and the AODA or the work in the US, they've moved closer to about 4% of spaces. And then the idea is that might not be enough in certain areas if you have an aging population where, again, you have more demand. So there's really important conversations happening all over the province, I think, but in this room, and the ideas and understanding you bring will be invaluable to really making it work.
And maybe if I could add to that just a little bit. So in the spring and in June, we passed the Accessible British Columbia Act. Now that act is an enabling act, so we have yet to fill out the standards and regulations within that act. And the built environment is definitely one piece of and one area of standards that we'll be building out into the act. And my job is to make sure that I'm connecting with groups like this. I'm hearing feedback, and hopefully that's reflected in the act. We just announced today our accessibility committee that's outlined within the act, and so that work's going to start very soon, probably early next year.
Great, thank you, Dan. And I'm just going to trickle back to the question around the different tiers or color-coded accessible parking for van accessible spaces or regular spaces, and pose that question to Mike. Mike, what are your thoughts on this idea? Or do you potentially have another suggestion?
Well, somebody who's been driving for 36 years and needing a parking pass, when I first applied for the pass, you had to be the driver of the vehicle and as well use a mobility device. After those with hidden disabilities required a closer spot as well, and that was acknowledged. I mean, in hindsight, I wish there would have been another identifier created at that point, because at that time, all spots were large enough for a person who drove a van or car and needed that spot. With the current regulations and the adoption of van accessible, I believe that is good, but that it doesn't include those who drive a car as well, and they need the extra spot. And within this province, many areas encounter winter, and wheeling a short distance is incredibly difficult. And they as well have to wheel through the parking lot where they're practically invisible. So like Lorraine says, I mean, it's, the numbers with the increasing population that needs them, is far lower than it should be. But I do agree that and say that as well, there should be an identifier, because those who need the extra spot, when we don't get a spot like that, like the hidden disability individuals, they can still park in every other spot practically in a parking lot. So those that need the extra width are at a huge disadvantage. And I'm involved in multiple societies and activities where we seek to really empower people. But that, you know, they can go out into a trail ride or paddling or sailing a boat, going out with their buddies and catching a fish. But that empowerment can soon, quickly come crashing down when, finding a basic parking spot is completely impossible. So I certainly believe that, the time has come, that something has to change.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Mike. Step one, we need a parking spot, right? To get to the experience, for sure. Christy, what are your thoughts on this topic?
In my personal experience, I also can park anywhere, for sure. I can. We all have a choice in a parking lot is the best way to go about it. But at the end of the day, if you don't open the doors for us to come in, we're already done with recovery. I've learned in the last 4 years, the more accessible my life becomes, the better my body gets. And recovery, it starts with your mind. And when these things aren't open for you and protected and available, you're already defeated before it starts. I could talk for hours about how the more spaces that open up, we've opened up pool here for me to swim. We've opened up parking spaces. We've got me into the schools. The more things that come, the better I get. And that's seriously something to consider in the health sectors, that this is a priority. Getting people to the doors, that's just the start. There's so much more work to do, but protecting those spaces to make sure they get to the doors is the key that's missing today. Yeah, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely, Christy. Thanks for your thoughts, for sure. And I have a question from Richard that I'm going to ask Lisa. Lisa, what special considerations are made in Vancouver City for drivers with SPARC permits?
I guess the really short answer is we don't. SPARC isn't the only provider of accessible parking permits, and I think everybody who has an accessible parking permit, whether it's provided by SPARC or by any other provider, I think they all get treated the same in terms of enforcement. If you have the permit and you're parked in an accessible space, then good to go. And if you don't have a permit and you're parked in an accessible space, not good to go. You can expect to get a ticket.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Lisa.
Of course.
And another question here.
Lorraine, did you want to
respond? I just wanted to add that the city also has been amazingly progressive, that in any residential zone where it would say by a permit only, if you have a SPARC placard or any other disability placard, you can park in those spaces. And that is actually has been an amazing move that the city's kept for a very long time to really ensure they are as accessible as possible. And I know that a lot of people comment on just what that means to them.
Right.
Lorraine.
And Lorraine, what are your thoughts on the different tiered or color-coded placards for different users?
I'm totally open to anything that would benefit the community. So this needs an important, deep conversation, because some people will say that the more identifiers you make on that placard, so some have also talked about, say, pictures on the wallet cards, some feel more vulnerable. That in a way, if you're signaling that this is a wheelchair user or someone, they may feel that this puts them at a certain risk. So I think there was a deep community conversation at the time. I think we can easily change and work to meet the needs, but you do want to have a bit of consensus around what's the best way to move forward. I do think too, in my mind, it is adding more parking and the right type of parking will solve some of the problems. I think changes to the Strata Tenure Act would solve other types of problems. And for sure, if there's a community consensus around the placard itself and that this would help to benefit, then let's look at it.
Any of our other panelists have a comment on that? Dan, what are your thoughts?
I mean, it's a difficult question, right? I've never really thought about the issue myself, but there's a lot of folks out there with invisible disabilities that do require this parking, and this is sort of, in some ways, creating a tiered system of disability as well, right? So, and I understand everyone's different, and everyone's disability is different, and the vehicles they drive are different, and some people require, like for me, and for instance, I require a lot of space. However, I can navigate, some distance to get to the front door. I don't necessarily need to be right beside the front door. Then there's other people who may not need the space, but need to be close to the front door. So, I mean, it's not something I've ever contemplated myself, but it's definitely something to talk about. And like Lorraine said, to have a deeper conversation around it if we were to do something like that.
Mm-hmm.
In my experience in the smaller community, Rob, this is the thing. I think it's a good thing that I'm on here too. We have central city areas and we have small rural areas trying to go under one rule to make it work for everybody. So when I worked with the Ministry of Transportation, I know that they made the traffic control manual for work on roadways with a gray line, and we were able to manipulate it outside of that line to apply it to roadways for change. So my question is, what if the government took that initiative on this Accessible Act and parking was a part of it? Could it have subsections that if you can relate and legally say this is needed for adjustment, this could be something municipalities could do on their own? I always find it's the biggest problem, because we could make a law for British Columbia, but up here, and we've talked about snow load already, it doesn't work, right? It'll work for mall parking lots and downtown central cities, but then we've got in Fort Nelson, for instance, which I know they don't work, right? The protection's not there. It doesn't make sense. That's always something that's been an issue. And on another note, with the different placards, I've always watched, people can't get their building owners, if it's a private building here in town, to put the ramp space out and the parking. They don't have to. So what they've done is they've said, okay, then we need a loading ramp. We have to load and unload. And that is a building bylaw that opened up a ramp for me to, say, get into fields. And I also have a parking space there too, beside their loading ramp. So that was a hole we found in small municipalities that might help once we hit these buildings where there's no law for their parking lots. Well, maybe they should have a loading and unloading space that is in their bylaw and their building permits. If that's something that we could lean on, was another suggestion I had for just the different placards and separating things and finding more space. Let's go in there. Yeah.
Could I just add that I think the point around hidden disabilities and the statistics is invaluable, and also Christy's point about the important role of local government. So when I look at the statistics, SPARC BC would issue about 55,000 permits per year. 25,000 of those are new, 25,000 of those are renewal. But if you actually look at the health and activity limitations data around individuals in the province who always report that they have reduced activity, you're looking at 1.6 million people almost. And even of those who say that sometimes they have a limitation, you look at 765,000. And so it is in behind. There is a lot of shifts and changes and pressures on the parking spaces that are available, and truthfully, likely not enough spaces. But your other challenges in cases where you have huge demand for those spaces is where you'll also have some really important enforcement issues around those spaces as well. So not only do we have enough spaces, but there can be issues around how those spaces get used. And I think that's part of the other problem that I see in our day-to-day activities. So we would have set up an accessibility and enforcement phone line. We get a couple calls a day. It depends, but it's these types of things, Christy, that you described that are really important. And I just want to mention, I was told, we had a legal opinion at one time, that the BC Building Code was considered to be like a bylaw of local government, but the issue was it dictated building. These issues are happening in occupancy. And so how you make that shift is really important, and whether local government needs more authority on the private spaces.
Thanks, Lorraine. Any more
I would like to
comment?
add, in Osoyoos, we are one of the oldest populations in the entire country. Lorraine provided data for me this morning, and almost half the population has limitations. There was almost 300 parking passes issued. So I would assume that something like 10% of the population or people who have cars, you know, have space or passes. So, you know, I guess Osoyoos is the canary in the coal mine, as they say.
Right. Thanks, Mike. Any other panelists have more thoughts on this question, this topic here? No? All right, I'm going to move to a question that's come through the chat. And I think I'll give this to Lisa to start with. UBC ACTRA now has a PWD committee, and I am on a mission to make sure that all studios have functional disability parking. Very often the spots are behind security gates, for example, on private land not accessible to the general public. Very often the spots are used for other vehicles. Who is responsible for providing these spots? Are the studios under municipal guidelines?
I can definitely take that one.
Okay.
The buildings that are built, at least in the city of Vancouver, need to follow our parking bylaw. And some of the rules in that parking bylaw include how many accessible spaces need to be provided, how big they are, and some of the other design criteria around them. However, something that comes up over and over again is our parking bylaw can only apply to buildings as they're being developed. So like if we change the bylaw today, then that will apply to all buildings in the future. But I can't go back to old buildings and say, you're not compliant with our bylaw anymore, or the parking lot that you've built now has evolved over the last 50 years and it's no longer compliant. I can only look forward. So depending on the types of buildings that UBCP and ACTRA are functioning in, they may be older, they might be following old standards, old guidelines, and they might have made management decisions over the years that aren't in compliance with the permit that they were approved with. So I wish I could do more in those circumstances, but limitation is really forward-looking from a policy perspective.
Right. Thanks, Lisa. Any other comments on municipal, I guess each municipality creates their own sort of standards for accessible parking. And so what are our thoughts around that? Mike, can you comment on that?
I could support it.
Yeah,
I could offer some support.
Yeah, absolutely. Go, Christy.
My mayor and council, hello, Mayor Foster. My mayor and council actually has his hand up right now, and I think he would love to take over because he was a big part of what we did here in Fort Nelson.
Perfect timing. Thank you, Mayor Foster. What are your thoughts on?
I don't know if he can unmute himself or if we have to unmute him.
Oh, okay, thanks, Emily or Angela. There we go.
There
Awesome.
we go.
There we go.
Okay, thanks. Well, I'll tell you one thing that's very important for a community is to have a very strong advocate like we have here in Fort Nelson, and that's Christy Lear. You know, having an advocate like that brings these issues towards council so that we can look at them and we can find solutions are very, very important. Councils are very busy, just like ministers are busy. And some things get swept under the carpet, or we move on to other issues when we don't have an advocate that brings these things in front of us. Christy brought the issue of parking to us, and we reacted to it and came to a better solution than what we had before. And we move ahead in these small increments. But I think, you know, when we're talking about how to gain better accessibility across the province, I think really the key is to have advocates come before their councils and make the case why these bylaws need to be changed and how they need to be changed. Most of the people who sit on councils are not experts on disabled parking. I certainly am not. But when you have an advocate who comes and says, do this, this is a good thing to do, and this is what it'll accomplish in the community. I think, you know, every council across British Columbia is eager to do things like that. But you need somebody to be that catalyst, to get this conversation going and to get the attention of local governments. And they will react, and they're delighted to react. I know ours were, Christy, I think everything that came before us was passed unanimously. So thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Foster. And thanks, Christy, for speaking up on behalf of all of us in your community.
There's one more that trick to that was my MLA as well. Dan Davies is on here. It took me approaching Dan Davies and saying, what do we do about parking, to figure out we had to include Mayor Foster. And those are 2 steps I would like to send forward to anybody at all in your municipality. That's the best place to start. What you'll find after that is the things that I found here in Fort Nelson, like some buildings are grandfathered, but we'll find a way around it. We're going to ask for a loading dock. And unfortunately, we can't reinvent the wheel, but I feel like we're setting the pace going forward. And we just have to clean up the rest through advocacy until we get there.
Right. Thanks, Christy. And I see Nelly, you have your hand up and you had something in the chat. Would you like me to read from the chat, or would you like to ask the question yourself, Nelly? I think we need to unmute Nelly.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, absolutely.
Hi, I'm Nelly Wong. I have a daughter. I'm a parent. I have a daughter who's 39 years old. She has cerebral palsy since birth. She lives in her own townhouse in Burnaby, and she requires 24-hour care. We purchased a van for her and equipped it with a side lift. I have been involved with the Disability Foundation because of our daughter, and she has participated in Disabled Gardening Association, the Trail Rider, and I find that the Disability Foundation has also helped her make adapted things, hands for her for gardening. And I just find that they are just so helpful in so many ways. I am on the Access Advisory Committee for the City of Burnaby. And as you know, Burnaby has just so many community structures that are being replaced. And we have an Access Advisory Committee made of people from Fraser Health, a lot of parents, and the chairperson is a employee as an engineer. And so we have a lot of advocacy going on there. And if a new development is going to take place, just recently I was involved in a new recreation complex, and we had our input into it with the architects. And I think that's where you get the most advocacy, because we could kind of have our input before something is built. And then once we see the plans and the architects have not finalized everything, we get a chance to look at it and say, oh my goodness, but the plans need to be altered because of the outside parking. Is a sheltered area? Is there wide enough spaces? And Burnaby, I feel, has been really, really good at accommodating people who have so many mobility issues. We have put in a system where if you are going to go vote, someone will come out to the car for you and bring that ballot out to you. So if a polling station isn't accessible, then that can happen. And also by the hospitals or any huge medical centers, they have painted the regular meters blue so that those will be the spots for people with a disability. And I just feel that I've been a member of the Access Committee since I retired about 20 years ago. And I just find that the caregivers for our daughter are just so thankful that the city of Burnaby listens to parents and individuals, because you need to ask us first before things get developed, and then they have to retrofit, which costs more. So that's all I have to say. And Stephanie Cadu came. I don't know if you remember or not, Stephanie, coming to visit my daughter. She lives in a townhouse in Burnaby, just about 10 minutes away from me. And she received that townhouse, not received it, but rented that townhouse because of the bonus density program that was offered to her. And she was just so lucky to have that townhouse. And she's been there for now 17 years. And I feel that many cities should be doing this bonus density program. And that has a lot to do with the housing. And there were 4 townhouses from BOSA offered to the city of Burnaby. And Burnaby, I guess, didn't want to be in the process of collecting rent and everything. So they gave that to the Burnaby Association for Community Inclusion. And that is where my daughter gets the funding, the CLBC funding from.
Awesome.
Okay,
Thank you, Nelly. Oh,
that's about all I have to talk about.
thanks, Nelly, for sharing that story.
You're
Appreciate
welcome.
it. Yeah. And Richard, you have your hand up. Have you ever got a question for one of the panelists?
I'm not sure if Mayor Foster is one of the panelists, but I just had a comment about, you mentioned how that if you've got, you need to have an advocate speaking out to make things, to make the councils and municipal governments aware of issues of parking and accessibility. Keep in mind that there's a huge number of us with disabilities that have debilitating fatigue and are much more required to put their energies towards food and doctors
appointments and so forth. So many of the people that really need these services don't really have much of a voice. So let's just keep that in mind. That's all.
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, absolutely. Point taken. I have a question that came up from the survey for Dan. 78% of our survey respondents felt that there was not enough public education around invisible disabilities that require accessible parking. Can you speak to this, Dan?
Yeah, I think it's unfortunate. I talk with folks all the time about parking, and like I was alluding to before, it sometimes seems like there's a hierarchy of disability that gets set up. In particular, folks who use mobility aids might not understand folks living with invisible disabilities and see them park in a spot and get out of a car, and they're there first. So then the person with the mobility aid can't use the spot. But I think people just have to be understanding. SPARC permits aren't given out very easily, and people get them for a reason. And just because the disability they have is not visible doesn't mean that they don't need that parking space, right? If they have a permit, they need that parking space, in my opinion. And I think people just need to be more understanding about that. Maybe Lorraine might have something to add as well.
Yeah, Lorraine, what are your comments on that?
I would echo that. Again, when I look at the statistics, so when I started with SPARC, I would hear concerns that they're given out way too easily. And so I often take now the census data on the health and activity limitations in a community. I look at if there's an aging population, and then I put it against the number of permits issued. And all of the time, you're quite humbled by how many people within the community will have a permanent disability or some type of episodic disability. And we see every day the individuals who come to our office, and they're dealing with a whole range of challenges in their life. Some will need mobility aids. Some have had surprise health conditions that they absolutely need that permit. So I use the data to guide me. And when I put the two pieces together, so again, 1.6 million British Columbians will have some type of health and activity limitation. Of that, about 587,000 will say it's a permanent condition. Then you look at those who say often. And you see this with the permit holders. Many know that there's not enough parking. So many will say to us, on a good day, I don't use the parking because I know someone needs it. And that's how I know I have a true permit holder who knows the value of the space. But again, across BC, you would be looking at 218,000 individuals who say they often will feel that they have a health and activity limitation that's limiting them. And then you have another 765,000 that say sometimes. And so put the age overlay on that and put some of the limitations to the building code. The previous building code, we're in a catch-up position in certain ways around the parking, and I think it all comes into play. Again, though, I really think that bringing community together like this, the leadership across the provincial government, and that's the current government, and I see Stephanie Cadu here, who's an amazing advocate on this issue as well. And then I echo what Mayor Foster says, that if you can actually get the attention of local councils, they will work hard on this.
Yeah, excellent conversation that fits with some more questions that have come in. So Lorraine, I'm going to ask you this question. Why do placards have an expiry date for those with permanent disabilities? The comment is, this is very frustrating to renew it every few years.
So and my apologies for that. So first, I want to actually say, if it is a hardship issue, so there is a processing fee of $26 for the permit, but if there's a hardship issue, it's immediately waived. That's not the issue, but the issue is more around the enforcement and taking permits out of circulation. So when we renew permits, we'll send out about 5,000 renewal notices a month, but only half are renewed. And that's because people will have had certain health challenges that meant they've passed away. And some will have no longer need the permit, so therefore they don't renew. And so we work to actually keep as many permits out of circulation as possible, so you limit the potential for misuse. And the 3-year was again actually determined by the disability community at the time as being a reasonable approach to balance some of these other challenges. But hardship, do not for a second, if it is a hardship to you, reach out to SPARC, because we're happy to deal with that aspect. I should also mention we changed the color of the temporary permits. We try to change it almost every year. So again, a temporary permit holder that maybe wanted to keep using that, the color will change. And so bylaw can more immediately see that that's someone using a permit that may no longer be valid. And a temporary permit is good for 1 year.
Okay, so that may have answered the next question, was that
I think some of the issues around the renewal for some people, that comes from a person who has a permanent disability and will always require one. So it can be considered that it could be automatic. I would suggest, and a notice still go out for perhaps a donation, but somebody who has a permanent disability, I think that's where the concern around the renewal process.
I can speak to that personally experience. Yeah, I assumed, and we all know what assume word means. Yeah, I figured, oh, I'm permanently disabled, I don't need to pay attention to this. But I did, and it got me a parking ticket, believe it or not. But I was able to call SPARC and say, hey, this is what happened. And they wrote a letter on my behalf, and I got disputed. In my experience, I'd say when I got my van, I should have been taught about the permit. It should be in the driver's program. And I hope that's something SPARC's working towards, because at GF Strong, I didn't know who you guys were. And I didn't know I should have talked to you before I drove away from there with my van. Hence my parking ticket.
right? Okay, so Lorraine, do you see creating a system of some sort, as we're chatting about, for those of us with permanent disabilities?
I think that it would be in some ways hard to do in a fair way. But as we look at how to strengthen the program, I'm open to ideas that have the broad consensus of those in the community that this would make a meaningful difference. If I was going to say my priorities, I'd put my energy and resources behind better and stronger enforcement, and that would include higher fines. And I think with the higher fines, you could actually reinvest in curb cuts and other improvements in the community. And so that's the direction I would go. But again, I'm open to learning more about how permit holders see it. I do think that the $26 processing fee, we try to keep the cost as low as possible, because we actually see SPARC as an important social service, and many people do not have the resources. So we try to keep the costs low, and where I would try to increase revenue or do things like that would be on the fine side. And so again, it's balancing all of these needs, and for sure listening and learning from those who see a valid reason to make change.
Yeah, okay, great. Lorraine, thanks. And you brought up the topic of enforcement. So we're actually going to move to a question around the lack of enforcement surrounding the misuse of accessible parking, because this is a huge issue that bubbled up through the survey as well. Many reported law officers claiming these issues were not their responsibility or out of their jurisdiction. So a lack of consequences leads to continued misuse of spots. Question for Lisa. Why is this a non-issue for police and traffic cops, and how can we bring more attention and therefore more enforcement to these offenses?
In the city of Vancouver, we have a lot of parking and a lot of metered parking and permit parking and otherwise regulated parking. So we actually have a huge fleet of bylaw enforcement officers, because those regulations around who can park on the street and when are bylaws. So those bylaw enforcement officers are the ones in charge of enforcing the bylaws. So they, quite frequently, I'll be honest, it does work on like a user report basis. Those officers are out patrolling the streets 24/7, but they don't see everything. And probably the best way to get action is to call 311 in the city of Vancouver if you see somebody who's misusing a spot like that. And it can be a really quick response time. We have a lot of enforcement officers, and they're pretty quick to get out to check on stuff like that, because it's a $200 ticket if you're parking in a non-street accessible space and you don't have a permit. It's a ticket we write not hugely frequently, but we do write them, and enforcement officers are pretty keen to write that permit because it's a pretty quick win for them.
Right.
Yeah.
And so again, that's a municipality decision. Is that correct, to attach that consequence to it?
That's right. And it is, I will caveat that it's only for on the street parking. And I know we heard in the survey with ACF and as well, we've heard it through surveys that we've run, that doesn't help anybody if you're trying to park in the surface lot outside of the Safeway, or you're running into Canadian Tire. Though the enforcement or the management of those lots is up to the property manager. So we don't have as much authority in those cases, but I understand that that's a really tough challenge when you're just trying to go and get your groceries.
Right. So perhaps more advocacy within each community to encourage some more enforcement around the parking.
Do you know how I enforce it?
Yeah, let us know. How do you enforce it, Christy?
I pull up and I look and I make a point of the situation that I know I shouldn't pull up into. And I offer learning. I don't yell. I don't say, hey, you're an idiot. I don't say, don't you see that placard there? I don't do that, because obviously they didn't see it. That's why they're there, or something's going on. They needed that space, just like I need it. But I do stay and I wait for the conversation. Or I've had some cool tools that I've been waiting to find again. And someone overdid it with Post-it stickers, but Ability to give me my van. And they gave me a sticker that said, you've left me in a tight spot. So we are able to leave that sticker on the person's window without having that conversation that's controversial and leaves them angry at handicapped spot users. You know, they're there for a reason. They either didn't see it, there wasn't enough awareness. It's not their fault. It's not like they go there every day and be like, oh, I'm going to find a handicap spot, take it over, make everybody mad, right? That's not why they did that. So we approach them in a learning atmosphere kind of a thing. And it's unfortunate. I experienced it one time and I'll never do it again. I had to call somebody out and it was very embarrassing for that person. And I will never do that again. Ever since that day, I wait to have that conversation. So if you guys could bring some more tools out for us, like these stickers, they were amazing. My friends use them all the time. I mean, if they were available with our parking permits, when you give us a new one, or as permit holders, maybe we can get them annually. And I know we're always worried about litter, but somebody doesn't take that and throw it in the garbage. They take it off their window and they put it in their car because they're embarrassed and they don't want to ever have that happen again. I've watched it. Yeah.
Good point.
Because you can't do much else. And I've asked them to step up. We have a program called Step Up, and we just promote it locally as much as we can. We just opened up a new parking space yesterday, actually. We did a ribbon cutting ceremony and we got asked to be present as an advocacy group labeled Step Up. So people went there and put all these shirts on. They were happy to show inclusion in the community, and they opened up a parking space that the business owner wouldn't do because they're grandfathered and it's not their responsibility. Yeah, community comes together.
Absolutely. Thanks.
If I could add a couple points to Christy's too, I do believe in the strength of community and how different people will approach SPARC. So we would have individuals who train local security guards who do work in the malls offered to add awareness to their security guard training. We did work with Safeway at one time, but now they're Sobeys, and so we lost the relationship. But they would actually put little enforcement notices on cars that said you may be parked here illegally and how to get a permit. So although I totally love your Post-it note idea, Christy, but the idea was then Safeway then would also play on their PSA system. So within the store, just rules about respecting the parking. And so you start to see different connections that can come together. And we're happy to partner in any way like that, including we'll explore these Post-it notes more. But I think it's conversations like these start us thinking about what we can do together in other ways.
Yeah, absolutely. Mike, do you have any ideas or suggestions on how to like mitigate this misuse?
Education, I think, is the biggest thing, and need more of it. You know, especially within the pass holders themselves. You know, I need an extra wide spot, but a person with a who doesn't need that extra wide spot will. I mean, there's, you know, the wide spots and the regular size ones, but so often the person not needing the extra space will head for the larger one first when they don't need it. So, I mean, it's education within the pass holders themselves as well.
Yeah, super good point. And that came up in a question as well. Lorraine, is there any educational literature handed out when you receive your accessible parking pass?
You would definitely get the rules of use of the program, but in a way, some of this parking etiquette that you're describing, we haven't done, but it would be possible to do. I see Marnie and Vince on this Zoom call too, and Marnie and Vince helped us do this project in the city of Richmond called Accessible Parking in Accessible Communities, and that was one of the things they found, the wrong size vehicle in the wrong size space. So maybe there is something we can actually do around that. So these are great suggestions. We can test and see if it helps as we try to move the dial on some of the bigger pieces.
Perfect. Oh, hi, Vince. How are you? You've got your hand up. So what are your thoughts and ideas around this topic? We need to unmute. There we go.
Thanks, Sonia. Nice to see you and nice to see everybody. This is awesome. Sorry I was late. I was on another Zoom call with the RCD, who are also celebrating this day by recognizing their volunteers. So I'm sorry I'm late getting on here, but it's nice to see everyone. I wanted to who is it? Christy, I think, mentioned grandfathering, and it led me to remember about something that's been mentioned in Richmond, and I think in our community here in Delta as well. You know, we've been fighting and we've been advocating for enhanced accessible parking spots, and municipalities have understood that and gone to change their bylaws in some cases, which is great. But we're getting also told that there's grandfathering. They can't ask businesses to go back and remark the ones that have been marked from before. And I guess my question, and there are a few government officials here, I'm wondering why there can't be, why that grandfathering clause can't be removed, and these businesses required to upgrade their standards so that, like Mike says, you know, the parking spot is going to be wide enough for vans and things like that. I'm sure that they don't have those grandfathering clauses in for other regulations that are in the building code, like fire regulations, sprinkler systems, seismic upgrades. So why can't they also do it for the parking spots?
Dan, do you want to address that question?
Sure, I'm working on the building codes currently, actually. as well as the Accessible BC Act. Most things in the building code aren't retroactive. Most things in the building code look forward. That said, the building code currently does not regulate accessible parking. However, municipalities have bylaws for it, and so I'll pass it over to Lisa, because this was a question that sort of came up before, and Lisa did answer it before as well.
Okay, thanks, Dan.
Thanks, Dan. Hey, Vince, nice to see you. Thanks for coming out. Dan, you did nail it pretty well, though. Our policies are really, they kind of have to be forward-looking, and the reason for that is all of our checks and balances and making sure everything's following all the rules. They're all kind of conditional on a permit. So when a building is being constructed, there's a whole bunch of different permits they have to get. Maybe they do a rezoning, and then they get a development permit, and then a building permit, and all the other permits associated with electrical and plumbing and that kind of stuff. And that's where a lot of our authority lies. So for parking, that usually falls under the building permit or the development permit. And so once those permits are issued and the building has become occupied, that's kind of where our authority, it doesn't end, but we lose a lot of authority at that point. So for example, going back to an older building and saying, you need to restripe your accessible spaces to meet the new standard, that can actually be like hugely expensive depending on the construction type. It could result in like fewer parking spaces overall because of column locations, and that's just not something that we can do at this point. But I would say that just puts that much more emphasis and importance on getting it right the first time, looking ahead. So the way that we write our bylaws now will influence our built form over the next 50, 80 years. So if we want our kids and our kids' kids to be able to park and move around the city in the way that we wish for them, that's what we're working on today.
Thanks, Lisa. I've got a question here from the chat, and also a comment from a practicing physician, Ramesh, and maybe this question will give Ramesh an opportunity to speak to. So I'll ask the question first. As a person with a permanent disability, again, why is it, hang on a second, I'm just going to read the whole comment. Why does a permanently disabled person like myself have to fight for their sticker or placard? Meanwhile, others who don't need it get it no problem. This needs to change. So perhaps a question for Lorraine, and then I can ask Ramesh to maybe speak to the placards and how they're given out.
Perfect. So we would rely on a doctor's referral, and many of the doctors that we work with, we know that they are very careful when they make that referral, knowing that there is a lot of need in the community for these spaces, but we totally depend on their judgment. And there are 3 tests. One of the questions is it a mobility related disability? Although safety, if it's someone with low vision or hearing where it is a safety issue, crossing the parking lot would also be eligible. But is it a mobility related disability? Would the individual face a significant risk to the health if they had to walk more than 100 meters? And then does this individual rely on a mobility aid? So the doctor does the assessment. We do not know the diagnosis or the condition requiring the permit, but we know that a doctor has made that informed judgment around that. It actually isn't just a doctor, a physiotherapist or an occupational therapist could also make that referral. So it is someone, a health practitioner in BC that has a valid MSP number. And just before I hand it over, I do want to give you one wonderful reassurance, which is our system can pick up if people make up an MSP number. So we know that we do have valid referrals. We do catch the odd one who has invented the need for the placard, and we are able to prevent and stop those. So I'll hand it over now to your physician.
Okay, thank you. Ramesh, the floor is all yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for having me as well there. I actually just got this invitation a few days ago. You are going very broad spectrum with this discussion, which may not be anything person to comment upon, but my question is mostly about the criteria of disability. Disability is a relative thing. Whether it's, say, give me an example of joint pain. So we want those patients to walk. If they don't walk, they may end up with more problems. But there are a lot of people that I know personally, and even my friends have this disability parking, which I don't think they are really disabled people though. Just because they have a knee pain or something, that doesn't make them disabled though. So question is, are there any criteria that you have fixed? Yes, mobility up to 100 meters, walking with the aid and all those things are all fine there. But there's a lot of gray zone still that we are dealing with it there. And sometimes, again, if patient has a stroke and unable to walk, then nobody even thinks about it. Person has a COPD, walking with the oxygen, nobody thinks about it. But I'm talking about person with a backache or leg pain or knee pain are relative things that, how do you define that these are people are truly disabled or you just leave it up to the doctor and the patient? I think maybe I'll stop it here and then I can carry on if there's any my personal suggestion there, because I think many people are abusing or misusing the system. That's what I would like to see avoiding. But then you have to back the physicians up as well. That what are the criteria?
Can I ask you a question off that, Remy?
Do
you think it was something that was in here already? I hope I don't jump ahead by bringing it up. Do you think that it would make more sense for the physiotherapist to do the release of these cards, or is it better with the doctor?
I would say doctor knows the patient better than the physiotherapist is. If you're only talking about mobility, maybe the physio knows. But if person has got diabetes, he's got neuropathy and all those things, the doctor will know better. So I do not see what the system is doing is unreasonable, asking the doctors to fill that form. But question is for doctors also, there's a lot of gray zone, what you really want the information, what you don't want the information. Is the person truly disabled or not there?
Yeah. So I could speak to some of this, and some of the others on this call might also as well. So for sure, we have been talking about doing more physician education to kind of remind doctors. But when we get the application forms in, I think many of the doctors have been very thoughtful in their assessment. So I would say if you think that the permit really isn't warranted, I would do a temporary permit. I would kind of trust that the individual seeking the permit may have a valid need for it. We may not fully understand it, but try with a temporary permit. We changed our application form to also let the physician signal that it's a condition that may improve, and we capture that in our system. Right now, it is only temporary or permanent, but again, we do have data where the physician's saying they're not really certain about this. The final point then is the permanent permit. You want to make that as related to the very specific need as possible. And so we would see quite a number of physicians now going into that middle ground, and that might be the signal that you're saying that it's just not as fully clear to you as it should be. So that would be kind of my starting point and understanding of some of this.
I think this is not understood. This should be more in black and white, though, whether it's a pain level or something like. I don't have the full answer to my question as well, though, but I'm just saying there's a lot of gray zone that needs to be looked into there. Like post-operatively, yes, I do many times give temporary like parking permit or parking restriction to people who have surgery. Yes, they need help there. Give them 2, 3, 6 months and they're fine. But I'm talking about the knee pain and the back pain patients who want these things. And actually, even my friends, I had a ride with them. They put the sticker on and they walk away as good as I do there. And really, I don't feel that they should be in there. Again, I'm not complaining about an individual, but I'm taking in generality. I'm talking about it though.
And so I would just add that I think physicians play an important gatekeeping role. And for sure, if you feel that you're unclear or others might be unclear, we could do more education. I don't think that's the issue. I'm a data type. So when I first kind of started, I thought, oh, I'll look at all our physician database and I'll see who's handing out way too many. And it's how you kind of see the world, even around disability and hidden disability. The numbers would tell us that relative to the level of need within the population, there aren't as many permits as we would think. There's too much need, and in a way, too few spaces, and a population that's changing, and a whole range of needs around this. When I kind of map my physicians against my communities, against my picture of individuals who are in need, there's no single physician that jumps out. They make referrals and they don't. And it looks like how you'd kind of understand the pattern within the community. So I don't see any specific physician doing too much relative to the needs in the community. You don't necessarily see a lot of permits out there. You do want to collect back expired permits. And for sure, you do want to be cautious. If you as a physician don't think that the person requires the permit, maybe there is something we can give you to amplify and reinforce your voice, but we would need the physician referral to trigger us enacting around issuing a permit.
Right.
I feel too, just based on what you just said, for the I forget your first name, the doctor that's on the call. I'm so sorry. Ramesh, based on what you just said, Ramesh, and I don't know if Dan and Lorraine can catch what I'm getting at. It sounds like there is a definite need for two types of handicap parking. People that use mobility devices in general in a van space, and people that don't in a regular stall that's already available in our communities today. Just that's what I just kind of had rolling in my head from what the doctor just said. You know, there's a definite divide that I can see, but like, what does that look like in the parking world? In the van spaces, it would open up a community that is different than the handicap that is originally here. The van space would be wider. And I just wonder too, that causes a divide in persons with disabilities, because now we got walkers and we got people who use aids. But my brain's going around in circles as it usually does with it. But that's what I just heard there. I think a device or not a device might help this big giant group where we can't figure out where people end and we began.
Mm-hmm. I think you'll still hit the shortage of spaces. If there was already van accessible parking or enough wide spaces, we wouldn't be having this challenge, because I think you'd see it would work itself through and that you could make those differences. So in a way, you have to add the right spaces in the right places to start the conversation. And then for sure, you could tell someone, oh, those extra wide spaces there for people who have mobility aids and who require that space. Your space beside, no problem, because we see there's a need and you would fit the criteria. But I don't think we have enough spaces.
Yeah. And Vince just put in a really good comment, took it right out of what I was thinking. Maybe it's not van parking, but if you're a person using a wheelchair, I couldn't agree with you more, Christy, that like that's the good place to start. Like we got to start with something, right? We might not get it right away, but we've got to start with something where we have spots for people who use wheelchairs. Maybe they're not driving a van, maybe they're driving a car, but they're a wheelchair user, so they need the extra spot. That's my 2 cents, but I'm the moderator. And I do need to ask Robin, because she's got her hand up and she's been waiting for a while, if she has a comment on this or a question. Robin.
Sorry, it took me a while to unmute.
That's okay.
I actually put my hand up some time ago, but I do have 3 points. The first one was about the new standards are going forward. That is, if they're in development bylaws, they only apply to new ones. And it's my opinion that will take too long and it will be haphazard. So you'll have a modern standard of accessible parking, both in supply and dimension, in areas that are undergoing rejuvenation or new development. But it's going to leave older areas with the old standard. So I'm thinking that there is something that local governments can do when they're new to regulation of accessible parking, because there are so many that haven't filled the gap that the provincial code left. When they're rolling out that new standard, could they not provide tools and grants and things like that for retrofitting? So once they have the public's attention, because they're going to be touting their achievement of this new bylaw and standard, then have almost like templates, turn 3 spaces into 2 or something like that. Some sort of proactive help, because it has to be attacked on 2 prongs. You won't get enough to keep up with the pace of disability growth with the aging population just by new buildings. So that was one point. Also, we've been talking about bylaws for private developments. What are governments doing themselves, local governments, to create their own standards and bind themselves to modern design and supply of accessible parking? And then the other one, a City of Victoria Facebook feed just came up while I was on the call, and it was a reminder about snow removal and their prioritization system. It doesn't include accessible parking stalls or the access from the stalls to the sidewalks that the merchants are supposed to keep clear. So I don't know if that can be embedded in bylaws, but who cares if you can park there if you can't get out of your car to where you need to go? Those were my 3 points.
Yeah, thanks, Robin, for your thoughts. Do any of the panelists have any feedback on Robin's thoughts?
Maybe if Lisa wouldn't mind if I went before.
Sure, go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, so this conversation is really I'm finding really valuable. It's something that I'm working on these issues and these standards currently, and I'm finding this really valuable in sort of the way I'm thinking, both in the different sizes of parking spaces, like the last question, and as well as thinking about how we do provide accessible parking in some of these older developments. So the Accessible BC Act, which we're developing standards on, and I know is not perfect, because I would like to see everything done now too, but we do have to do proper consultation. Part of what this act is going to do is it's going to transform the way we think about disability. It's going to transform, the biggest barrier to folks with disabilities is the attitudinal barrier that wider society has. It's not necessarily, it's a much wider problem than just codes or standards, right? This piece of legislation, I can see it as a vehicle for transforming British Columbia into the most accessible province by making everyone understand how important accessibility is, and like you said, Robin, providing them with the tools to make their businesses, developments, or other spaces accessible as well. So with that, I'll pass it over to Lisa.
Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, Dan. I wrote a couple notes while you were speaking, Robin, because I wanted to make sure I touched on everything. But I think your second question was about what are municipalities doing to improve? Because you're quite right, we don't have it perfect, far from. But a couple of things that we've done in the last few years, but honestly extending quite a ways back, is really around listening. I'll be honest, all the people working, or myself and all the people on my team, we are temporarily able-bodied people. We do not have the lived experience that so many of you on this call have, and that's why I'm really happy to shut up and listen for a lot of these things. So in addition to these kinds of forums, we ran a big survey. I know a few of you on the call participated in the survey. Thank you. A couple of years ago, trying to get a feel for what the parking experience is like in Vancouver, recognizing that it's a destination for people of the region too, so not just for residents, but people traveling into Vancouver. That was super insightful. Over 1,000 people responded, and there's a ton of information there. And then we also are really fortunate to have our Persons with Disabilities Advisory Committee, also a few of you on the call. Thank you so much for joining, who are so wonderful when we bounce ideas off of you guys. So I'm really grateful for that community of people. But the main thing we're working on right now is van accessible parking. So I'm really excited that it's come up a couple times in the call already. Lorraine mentioned we co-hosted a design charrette together with SPARC BC earlier this year. Yeah, still 2021 this summer, where we got to observe a bunch of people driving and parking and trying to use different sizes of spaces and what was working and what was clearly not working. And our outcome of that is how important van accessible spaces are, and whether it's for a van specifically or somebody from the outcome of that charrette, it looked a lot more like people with like lifts. But either way, having a little bit of extra space for those people that do need it. That's been our focus for the last year or so. We had to take a bit of a pause when COVID hit because we couldn't collect the data that we wanted to, but yeah, that's our next thing coming out of the City of Vancouver, so stay tuned. Thanks for your question, Robin.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. And, you know, you've really touched on something that it's like back and forth, right? Like we have to advocate for ourselves, but yeah, the municipalities have to listen too. And that's the give and take. So thank you for listening. And we need to encourage our other municipalities to listen to the advocates. But I think also as an advocate, we need to make sure that we're coming from a quieter space so that it can be heard. Just sometimes if it comes across too hard, it gets shut down. So thanks for listening. And so a question that Vince also is asking, is there an inventory or list of municipalities with enhanced accessible parking bylaws? Can the standards go back to the province so it is more standardized? Would this be maybe a question for Dan, or it looks like you're ready to answer it, or Lorraine? Dan,
yeah,
do you want to fly at this one? Okay.
I was prepared to give something that resembled an answer.
Sure.
So this question was asked earlier, Vince, about if we had that inventory or if I knew, and I don't at the moment. Out of the 200 plus municipalities across BC, we haven't taken an inventory, but it's definitely something to consider. And thank you for the suggestion. I can't make promises because the work of the accessibility committee isn't done, as well as the work of that I'm doing on building codes right now, which you can all have input in. If you go to engage.gov.bc.ca right now, we do have a survey up until January 13th. So if you would like to weigh in on accessibility features that you'd like to see in the building code, you can go there. But we are doing work on the building code. Parking has been discussed. I can't say if it would be brought back to the province. We haven't made any decisions like that, but there is the potential for this. And that's why it's great to hear the feedback here, for me to hear the feedback here, because this is, my job is to consult on accessibility within the building code and accessibility when it comes to the Accessible BC Act. So, it might not be the most satisfactory answer, but thank you for asking the questions, and thanks for allowing me to be a part of this event today.
Thanks, Dan.
I know the Northern BC mayor and councils, they're the only ones I've talked to my whole life, but I know they all get together and they do annually. Maybe those reports happen in other places as well. I just know in the northern corridor, they do get together as mayors a lot, or maybe those reports could come to you, Dan.
That would be great. I'll just type my email address into the chat.
Perfect. Thanks, Dan. I don't remember who brought it up, but the attitudinal barrier topic got brought up. So what are some of the panelists' thoughts around how to address this barrier? Christy, do you want to fly at that, or Mike?
The attitudinal barrier. I only have grade 12. What does that word mean?
So just people's attitude around their around persons with disabilities, how we're being treated, how people view those of us with different abilities. So people's attitudes towards us. Yeah. Mike,
that's a hard one for me.
I mean, I think it's come a long way. I mean, I was injured prior to Rick Hansen wheeling around the world. So I think, you know, prior to that, I just, you know, I think back, when I was injured, I loved to shoot rifle, and you know, a year after I was hurt, wheeled up to a entry table at a turkey shoot, and they looked at me like I was, you know, extremely disabled. And at the time, I felt the same way. But you know, I after winning 6 straight matches, and then they said, well, would I quit? But I think, you know, overall, people have seen people succeed while having a disability, you know, having families, compete in sport, and various other things. So I think it's come a long way. And you know, and a lot this stemmed from kids, even, you know, still parents, you know, if a kid comes up to you and tries to ask a question, you know, the parents may, you know, hush, but a lot are saying, oh, go ahead and ask questions, right? So, you know, overall, I think it's come a long way. So, you know, that's my opinion.
For me, from my generation and my experience, I'm always embarrassed to say this in public, but I do, because it does mean a lot. Before I got in my car accident and broke my neck, I assumed people were in wheelchairs because their brains weren't working. And that's from a small town, isolated opinion that resources and things don't outreach me. Maybe it was the way I was raised in my family. But I've talked to a lot of other people who are really keen on accountability in their life all of a sudden now, and they'll state the same thing. I just assume because you have an aid or something is broken on you, that's it. People don't see that we can get farther and get past it. People don't see that that's not it. Oh, there's a wheelchair. Well, no, there's a potential. That's what that is. And it's what STEM Step Up and this program and this symbol on my shirt was. I feel like it hasn't evolved. I feel like it's gotten worse, and I feel like we've been capped hard. And people with disabilities, they have so many opportunities that they're not open to due to accessibility issues. And I think it's worse, honestly, now more than ever, because now we just don't even get in. I see people, they'd rather bring me something from in a store instead of say, hey, Christy, let's get you out and let's see what it takes to get you in here. And maybe in a month, you can come in. No, they think that's okay to just serve me in my car. Well, that's not what I want. I want to go inside, right? Mm-hmm. So I guess what I'm saying is the oh well attitude is really huge right now, in my opinion. Oh well, we'll just figure it out. But that's leaving us all palliative, because they're bringing the world to us instead of opening up the world for us. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. It makes sense. And I think you had a couple of comments coming through that echoed your thoughts, that it almost feels like it's going a little bit backwards. And yeah, I mean, I think we're still dealing with parking and main entrances and accessible washrooms. And we need those 3 key priority accessible features in place to participate in community, whatever that is. So absolutely.
Yes, accessibility still has a long way to go.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question about Motor Vehicle Act? Is there time for that?
Sure. Ask the question, Christy.
Well, what role does the Motor Vehicle Act play in parking? Because we need to drive a vehicle to get to these parking spaces that are such an issue. And I personally don't remember ever seeing anything on my driver's training about accessible parking spaces or what the use of them are for. And I think that that's something other drivers should be aware of. In the Motor Vehicle Act or in the licensing program in general, maybe some attention can be brought there, because I think that's where this could start. And the Motor Vehicle Act also is law. So if we want to regulate signs or new parking spaces, I feel like they should be really involved in these conversations. I'm not sure if they have been or not, but to me, in my experience, that plays a pretty big key. Sign, enforcement, bylaw, charges, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then to get them off their charges, I think Lorraine and SPARC BC, I don't know where I heard about it before, but there's a program, or could open up a program, that if you get charged, if you get a fine, we'll reduce your fine by 20% if you take this course about handicapped parking spaces and how to do better next time. Something along those lines, right? Of a reward program for information for less of a fine.
Right. Dan, do you have any comments on Christy's suggestion around the Motor Vehicle Act being a part of this dilemma?
Yeah, the Motor Vehicle Act currently has zero to say about parking, but this is it's good feedback. It's good for me to hear for sure. And it's questions that I can go back and ask my colleagues about. But yeah, thank you for bringing it up anyway. And thanks for, for telling us about it.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Dan. And I've got a comment and a question coming in. Do panelists think there's any role for the provincial human rights system in BC for addressing this issue, the attitudinal issue? Are the BC Human Rights Tribunal or Commission engaged in any way? I think that's coming at you again, Dan.
Yeah, it's good. I like answering questions. Okay. So the accessibility legislation, which is what I was talking about, that will address the attitudinal issue. The Human Rights Commissioner, was able to have some input into what that legislation looked like, and I believe they're quite happy with it. I'm not sure. I think the attitudinal issue is going to be, the BC Human Rights Commission is definitely well placed to address breaches of human rights. I don't know that it's going to be a venue where we'll be able to have attitudinal change. That's going to be a society-wide change. And part of that is going out there and talking to folks about this legislation and making sure that the legislation is well understood and as effective as possible. And that means that I'm reaching out to, communities besides the disability community around accessibility. And I'm reaching out to the business community, the labor community, just the community at large, to make people realize that, making things accessible isn't a burden. It's actually helping your fellow humans participate in everyday life. Identifying and preventing and removing barriers is vital for folks with disabilities to be able to participate meaningfully and fully in their communities. And I think, when we start framing accessibility in that lens, rather than in a lens of, hey, this is going to cost you some more money, I think at that point we start to bring about attitudinal transformative change. And so I'm quite excited about the work I'm doing, and hopeful that this is something we're going to do.
Yeah, very true. We need to speak to the I think the compassion and the understanding of why we need these spots, why we need the attitude change. We want to make sure we're fully inclusive to everybody, and by doing the opposite, that's what we're doing. We're leaving people out. So there needs to be understanding and compassion for sure.
I also really like what Lisa said, where she said, that she was temporarily abled.
I did too. Yeah.
I think if people understand it in that lens, because well, I'm disabled, but everyone is temporarily abled. When you think about, aging, there are going to be barriers that you are going to have to overcome as you age. Mm-hmm. And, sometimes you're just a bad bike ride away from being disabled as well. So I think that's a really good way to frame it, and part of probably the way that we're going to get there with some system or society-wide attitudinal change.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. I'm going to kind of circle back to something that came up earlier, and then we didn't get a chance to speak to it, but it has been a hot topic through the survey, is snow removal. And perhaps, Lisa, I'm going to throw this at you around snow removal. And often, you know, sometimes that snow removal gets removed from other places and put in the accessible parking spots. It gets used for that. And it's, yeah, what can you say about snow removal?
I can say that if people are piling up snow in their accessible parking spaces, that's not cool.
Wrong.
Wrong. From a city perspective and how we clean our roads, our priorities are usually around the major roads and bus routes first, recognizing that not everybody has a car, number one. Not everybody chooses to use their car. And a lot of people, especially in Vancouver, don't have cars suitable for driving in the snow. So a lot of people rely on public transit during snow events. And so we want to make sure that those buses can operate safely, moving a lot of people on those major corridors. Beyond that, then obviously we look at bridges and emergency access routes. And we also look at bike routes because we have, I know we've been criticized in the past that it can often appear that our protected bike lanes get plowed before a lot of roads or sidewalks. That's not intentional. We just only have a couple of pieces of equipment that fit into the bike lane, and they move around pretty quickly, and they're quite nimble. But bike lanes can also be an option for somebody who's wheeling because they do usually get cleared quite quickly. But sidewalks are a big thing. I'm sure some folks on the call have heard there's been studies around how do you prioritize snow clearing for better health outcomes. And like I just said, City of Vancouver, we focus on roads and bus routes, but there's some research to suggest that if you focus on sidewalks, you know, near schools, that's how you prevent more injury, because they're like those are where the slips, trips, and falls happen. And if you're, you know, wheeling in a wheelchair or pushing a baby in a pram, that's where a lot of those incidents occur. So it's actually something that we're looking at in a lot closer detail, because currently most of our sidewalks get plowed by the adjacent neighbor. You know, the business is responsible for clearing the sidewalk in front of their store or the resident in front of their house. And we have programs to help your neighbor do that if your neighbor is unable to. But you definitely should not be piling up snow in the accessible parking spaces in your parking lot. That's for sure.
Just going to throw this question out to Mike. How is your community in terms of snow removal around accessible parking spots?
Oh, thankfully we don't get very much rain or snow, but when it does snow, it's still an issue. I guess while it doesn't snow very often, when it does, there's no real procedure how to do it well. So,
right. Okay, so we have 5 minutes left till we get to some of our closing comments. Just going to take a look at a few more comments and questions that have come in.
I had somebody had a really neat thing they thought about for these parking spaces to keep them protected in the winter.
Right.
Now, I'm not sure even if it's possible. It's a futuristic type thing. You know, they said where the parking sign goes, if there was something that the light would shine through to shine onto the parking space. So when a person gets out of their car, it'll actually light up the handicap sign over their car, like using the sunlight or like this or the light. Do you know what I mean? And it would be like a shadow. So when this person who let's be them for a minute. I'm driving, it's snowy out. I just got to get to the bank and I've got kids on my mind and my phone is ringing. I'm just going to pull in here because it's the safest place because I'm unsafe right now, and got out. Well, they didn't realize they were in a handicap spot because every part that shows it is now covered by what I just described. But when they close their door and they check their own car, because they will, it's going to see this big signal right over top of it, like the bat signal almost. Do you know what I mean? It'll light up through a light on something, but it's like so futuristic. But I love the idea because literally you can't cover it up there. It's going to go on your car now. You're in the wrong place or you're in the right place.
Right. Yeah. Very creative. Interesting. And I think that speaks to how important it is that we have post signage, because, you know, just signage on the surface doesn't stand up when there's snow, or perhaps they get faded, or like you said, somebody is busy, crazy, and they pull into a spot. Well, post signage would help a little bit more than not having it.
Yeah.
Perfect. Oh, we're slowly getting down to 2:55 when I have to deliver some closing remarks. So yeah. Do any of the panelists have anything else they want to add before we have to wind down?
Yes, I think overall, I think we need better standards for the wheelchair users, because so many of the spots, while being designated for wheelchair use, are not acceptable. But with that as well, I think with the aging population and so many more people using the spots, that they do have to be separated. While I think you know, a different placard, you know, walker with a cane, something like that. So more spots separated, education and enforcement are huge.
Yes. Mike, you've pulled out some of those main topics that have bubbled to the surface and really need to be addressed first and foremost. Absolutely. Thank you for making that comment. So if there's no more comments from any of the panelists, I'll just take a few minutes to close with some closing remarks. And thank everyone for attending this Accessible Community Forum on accessible parking. We had an amazing conversation today with lots of valid points and thoughts brought to the table. A transcript of this event will be emailed out to all of the attendees, as well as a summary of our survey findings next week. Please take a moment to fill out the survey on your screen and tell us how we did today. If you have any follow-up questions, concerns, comments, or ideas for future community forums, please email our program coordinator, Emily, at echambers@connectra.org. This email is also posted in the chat with the individual panelist emails as well. And we will also provide this information in our summary email to all attendees. The Disability Foundation, ConnecTra, and SPARC BC are all nonprofit charitable organizations. And with the holidays coming up, this is a great time to support a cause that you believe in. Whether that's us or another organization in the community, your generosity can really go a long way. If you can make a gift today at disabilityfoundation.org/support or spark.bc.ca/donate, that would be fabulous. Check out all of the various community events we offer at connectra.org/events. And don't forget to sign up for our disability opinion research panel at disabilityfoundation.org/research. Thank you all again for being here today and sharing with all of your thoughts and ideas and suggestions around accessible parking. And have a great evening and happy holidays. Merry Christmas to everyone. And let's keep hammering down on this topic of accessible parking, when we'll definitely be successful in making some changes. We've had some great suggestions come out of this discussion today. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Sonia. See you, everybody.
Bye,
Thanks, guys. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. Sonia, thank you so much.
Thanks, Emily.
I'm not sure. I think the poll didn't come up. I'm not sure why, but we'll make sure to try and email it out afterwards.
I'm trying to.
I've got one response.
Well, I was trying to put it in, but I can't add anything.
That's weird.
Did anyone else have it pop up for them?
Popped up for me, but I can't seem to enter anything.
Huh.
I'm not sure why.
Interesting. It's our first time doing a Zoom poll, so this could be well, in case anyone is trying to finish it, I'll just leave it open for a couple more minutes. But yeah, otherwise, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, everybody.
And yeah, everyone can